Well, we're grateful for everyone that's able to join and view this, and grateful for Red being here. Fernando, thank you for setting this up. Um, I think first off, maligayang araw ng Kalayaan, and I believe it's fitting that we're um, doing this, moving forward with this event. We stand together, we fight together, and on today, Araw ng Kalayaan, which is a Filipino Independence Day. And I think it's fitting that we're having this discussion on Araw ng Kalayaan with Renato Redentor Constantino, who is the grandson of Renato Constantino and the executive director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. Renato Constantino spoke about the miseducation of the Filipino as being an antithesis of the liberation of the Filipino. And we're having a discussion today with hopefully Justin Mendoza of the University of Texas San Antonio Filipino Student Association. Will be able to join us later on. And we're having a discussion about taking steps through education to produce citizens that are able to contribute to their homeland. Justin Mendoza and the Filipino Student Association they're going to do what they can to try to help create sustainable cities back in U1, I believe it is, in the Philippines, using their educational platform to help their homeland. And so we're hoping to get into that discussion as soon as Justin is able to join us. In the meantime, Red, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us more about the center.
Sure thing. Rich and Fernando, thanks for having me. Um, uh, this is indeed a very important uh, occasion, and thankfully, the way that you have organized the events it's not a one-off event. It's connected to a series of activities, some of which have already taken place, and some of which are still going to be held after this particular event. I head the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. It's an international climate policy group that works on fair climate policy in the Philippines, but also internationally, advising different governments of some of the most vulnerable countries around the world. And among our programs is to run what we call a pioneering Solar Scholars program in Eastern Visayas in the Philippines, where we train community leaders, in particular women, in terms of how to conduct energy audits, how to deploy and assemble and renewable energy systems for their communities, and how to train others. It's a paid forward program that is trying to provide renewable power to power community health systems, in particular schools and village initiatives. And that's one of my hats. The other hat I wear is that I'm the managing director of the Constantino Foundation, which is working on pedagogy and different approaches to making people understand the usable past and how we can use history to change our future. And good evening, but also good morning to you, to your lovely wife. Hello, good to see you again.
Yes, and so when you're speaking of we had a discussion about this, and I'm gonna go ahead and say the word white supremacist mentality that's pervaded much of America and the Philippines, Western culture, however we want to call it. But a lot of times it would have people kind of acting, voting, speaking against their own best interests. So when you see of a student such as Justin and the Filipino Student Association, um, and they're willing to get involved in this way, to stand up for the culture and to stand with the culture and take action to help their culture. How does that play into the mindset and the I guess the mission behind the Constantino Foundation?
Well, first of all, I think that term is not used often enough, and that term of white supremacy is something that we're all grappling with. Some are new issues, and some are long-standing, lingering issues of pain and injustice. One really important example that I think the U.S. has been experiencing in particular, and I'm glad that Emmy is around as well, because I'm pretty sure the conversation around this is pretty vivid, is that um, uh, white supremacy is also the reason, not just behind the violence and pain of so many peoples, not just in the US, but also the reason behind persistent, decades long attempts to divide those who are not white and to pit us against one another. And the other side of that coin, of course, is persistent, just as persistent, and I think even more determined efforts from Asian peoples and from African Americans to say no way, including Latinos, that you will not divide us. This is not going to be the narrative that will play out, and we refuse to go by your narrative. History, of course, shows us that this is not a recent occurrence. It comes up every now and then, it bubbles up. Um, and unfortunately, some people die, many gets hurt, livelihoods are lost, lives are destroyed. But the struggle and the resistance, I think, continue to move forward, gain strength. We encounter setbacks, but we learn as well. And our ability to actually move forward decisively together rests on a solid grasp of history. And history not just of injustice. I think when we look at June 12, or when we look at Juneteenth in June 19th, coming in a few days, I think what we need to also remind ourselves of is not just the binary past that defines who are the victims and who are the oppressors, but a past that shows us that history is all about connections that we haven't made enough of, that we still need to tease out and need to establish, because there's more to history than just politics and oppression and subjugation. Those are all big threads in the entire fabric. But what we need to see as well is the connections that bind us together, and the connections that bind us together are the means by which we can overthrow the system of oppression. And it's not just about white supremacy, it's about the legacy of greed and avarice of a couple of people, a few, gaining sway over the interests of the majority. And so this narrative definitely runs very deep. If it was a river, that river would be very deep in Texas, in San Antonio, but certainly that river leads straight to countries like the Philippines as well. And we need to understand that, because there's much to correct, but I also say there's much to celebrate. If we cannot celebrate our ties together, then I don't think we have any future. Because in the end, we fight, but we fight because we want a future that we can celebrate together too.
Right, absolutely. And just through this project, I've been surprised at just how many stories there were of collaboration between the two cultures. I know it's not often taught, and I guess the reason I was surprised because it's not taught in the history books. A lot of it is this, I guess, educating yourself. So I guess what role would you say we have as individuals or a student, someone in college even in high school or middle school, a student that's not being taught, what would be the best route that they could take? What role would they have in kind of discovering their culture, their own culture for themselves?
Um, the first thing I think that um, is not repeated often enough is for young people to stay curious. And I don't mean just young African Americans or young Asians or young Filipinos or young Latinos, um, young white people as well, even more so. Um, uh, to me, Rich, marking dates always comes with different degrees of remembrance, and today is no different. And yet, because many of us have been trained to simplify the world, young people especially, perhaps simplify, perhaps so that it might fit into neatly constructed mental boxes filled with what we think are recognizable things. Many Filipinos, for instance, mark June 12 in this way, a response to what seems to be a one-time offer for the entire year, where we can show love of country and embrace a flag and collective purpose, a unity predicated on things we can agree on, but with little interest or understanding in the complexities behind the date of celebration. Um, we won't dwell too much on the details in this event. Perhaps we'll cover more of it in the following week. But, Rich, one important facet that is worth sharing. June 12 is known as Independence Day for the Philippines. It's also called Freedom Day widely by Filipinos. And yet, too few still recognize, while there was indeed a Declaration of Independence on June 12, the declaration also read that on the same day in 1898, the Philippines was declaring its independence from Spain under the protection of the mighty and humane great North American nation.
Mhm.
Verbatim. It should make you pause, because one can also argue that June 12 was the day a few Philippine officials who later capitulated to the US occupiers declared the nation as a protectorate of the US, the very country that had embarked on an imperial quest to subjugate an entire people who happened to be exhausted after defeating the colonial rule of Spain. Not exactly emancipation. So, do we forget about June 12? No way. But we need to reflect deeply and properly on the said date and its implications on national memory and the virtually erased past of resistance to the imperial designs of the US. It's similar to Juneteenth. June 19, 1865, there was an announcement by Granger proclaiming freedom from slavery in Texas. And then you have in 1915, the birth of a nation is shown in the White House, celebrating the Klan. And so history is very complex. There's no black and white here.
Very.
But the more you dig, the more I hope young people gain more interest, because life itself today is not black and white. It is the grays that we need to be curious about, because in those grays, we will find ourselves. I hope we find ourselves.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Um, and we talk about, that's actually, it just takes it to a different level, and I guess even more of a challenge. Since I met you, or since we met virtually, and since I've been reading your works, having these conversations with you, it's been challenging because it's pushing me and pushing the perspective to be beyond what we've been consumed with politics. Democrat, Republican, white, black, whatever, like side, just choosing these simple sides, as you say. Whereas there's, we're getting away from telling the whole story and trying to tell the whole, see the whole truth. And that the Western colonization, it runs deep. Even though we're celebrating these dates, they're just these moments, as you say. And it seems like the real work goes to what Renato Constantino spoke about in the Miseducation of the Filipino, and what Carter G. Woodson spoke about in the Miseducation of the Negro. Whereas if we can have these great dates, but if Western colonization is still controlling our educational institutions, then we're still, we're not where we need to be. The progress, I think, comes from deconstructing this entire concept of our education, how we view the world. So they're, like an example of what you're saying, they were probably fine to see the Filipino people declare an Independence Day so long as they're still giving credit to North America. So even in our independence, sometimes we're still, because of the way we've been educated, it's still entrenched in us and ingrained in us so much that even in our stances, and I've noticed it even in myself sometimes, there's a part of me that still, reverts back to this colonized way of thinking and some things. So I guess, what would you say some base work just to even begin that process would be, just to undo the internal colonization that we all deal with?
Um, there's so many facets to this, to what you asked, because I think the dynamic of our current situation is pretty much still trying to follow the logic of the not so recent past. Carter Woodson talked about a lot about proper place, and I'm pretty sure proper place is the very thing that Fernando will never accept, just as Emmy will not accept the model Asian, the model citizen. Stay quiet, stay there, don't rock the boat, and the training that says there is an order to this world, and you're at the bottom of the food chain. Accept it and be better and be happy. Don't rock the boat, otherwise you'll get into trouble. And that's what young people do not accept anymore. Young people today, especially, have raised the bar, have raised the standards of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And I think from the teachings of miseducation, we can see many different facets that I think will take us many years of entertaining and edifying discussion. I mean, when you talk about June 12 and the Philippines, it is almost impossible for any curious person not to see, if they dig deep enough, the intersections between the history that Carter Woodson had dealt with and the history of the Philippines today. I mean, even in my own work as a heading a climate institute, the intersection is pretty astounding. I mean, Carter Woodson was a coal miner, and it's a past that we're all trying to leave behind. We are all, I would like to think, grappling and fighting against the many different slaveries today. And we must speak of different slaveries. The slavery of ignorance that is still driving people, maybe not even to recognize white supremacy, even if they're practicing that faith. The slavery of ignorance, the slavery of miseducation, the slavery of maldevelopment that is producing inequality and poverty, whether you're in the US or Texas or in the Philippines. The slavery of fossil fuel addiction that has, I think, just pulled Texas through a harrowing winter of incompetence by the US government. The slavery of misogyny is still rampant up to today, but we don't necessarily see it that way. The dictatorship of accumulation and consumption are still things that we're grappling with. And the history of the Philippines is so much tied up with what I think is the basis or the origins of Black History Month. A long time ago, when the U.S. had occupied the Philippines, and brought so many occupiers to our land, it was probably seen, not seen by many, but I hope will be seen more and more by others, that the U.S. occupied the Philippines through two armies. The first one was through weapons, through arms. The second one was more devastating, and that's something as well that I think Carter Woodson and Renato Constantino had talked about, and that was to occupy the minds and hearts of people. General Arthur MacArthur, the father of General Douglas MacArthur. Arthur MacArthur, the father, was one of those who led the occupation of the Philippines before, and he understood the requirements of the two armies. and I quote, according to General Arthur MacArthur, this appropriation for education of the Philippines is recommended primarily and exclusively as an adjunct to military operations, calculated to pacify the people and to procure and expedite the restoration of tranquility throughout the archipelago. And another author of a book who released it in 1901, Charles Burke Elliott, said, the transport, Thomas, where the word Thomasites come from, because that was the Second Army, the army of teachers from the US that ensured that whole minds would be molded according to their wants. Elliot wrote the transport Thomas was fitted up for their accommodation, and in July 1901, the transport sailed from San Francisco with 600 teachers, a second army of occupation, surely the most remarkable cargo ever carried to an Oriental economy. That was way back then. And the result is many things, but something that I would also say is very much true. The American authorities embarked on a decades-long drive to Philippinize government after they had succeeded in occupying the archipelago. But the last agency, the last department they ever relinquished was the Department of Education. They only appointed the Filipino in 1935 when they invaded the Philippines in 1899. Why? Because by 1935, they had assured already that an entire generation had already been indoctrinated and molded into thinking the way they would want them to be. Docility, docile, looking up at the American occupiers and thanking those who had invaded us and taken our freedom as our liberators. Up to today, too few among Filipinos, even less in the US, remember the Philippine-American War. In fact, I took a glance at the NAACP's intro of Carter Woodson, and understandably, Woodson is celebrated, but they don't mention, I think wrongly, in their intro that Woodson actually was also sent to the Philippines on a ship called Korea, but part of the big educators. And, you know, I think more African Americans should understand how closely our histories are tied up, because I think although there might not be solid evidence at the moment, or maybe there is, as many suspect, Woodson also saw the implications, the dangers, the horrors, and the opportunities that lie in education to do really bad things or to liberate many.
Yeah. No, I think that's 100% accurate. And actually, Fernando, I was going to ask you, I know he actually developed a timeline that really supports what you just mentioned. Would you be willing to go into that, Fernando?
Yeah, it's funny how as he was talking, like that's literally what was going through my mind. Like literally, like around that time that the Philippines, like the Americas was occupying the Philippines. I think that was when Woodson was over there, and that's actually what he was seeing a lot of times when he was seeing, and because he was sent over there to teach in the Filipino schools, and by that time, again, the curriculum had already been colonized. So like what he had noticed was that their history was completely like they were learning about their history, but it didn't have any of their contributions in it. Like it was like completely like rid of their own contributions in their own education curriculum, but it's like they were teaching it over there, and that just didn't sit with him. And then he started, I guess, if I could imagine sort of like, how his brain was working, he saw a lot of similarities of what was going on in the American school system here in America around that same time. And that's, I think, the birth of where the miseducation of the Negro sort of came from. And if you think about it, that's, the names are similar, you know what I mean? Miseducation of the Filipino, miseducation of the Negro. Like there is, I agree with Red that I think that's a portion that, while it's not taught in, I'll use the term mainstream just for right now, mainstream American history, it's also not taught in Black history. You know what I mean? Like I think there's I don't know if there's an incessant way to, I guess I don't know if there's a reason why it's not, or maybe there's just enough familiarity with it. I don't know. I mean, there's so many different reasons for why that's the way it is, but I definitely will say that around, history is full of text and context. That's literally what it is. You know what I mean? It's filled with, change over time, traditions and encounters with those traditions. And I definitely will say that around that time, what was going on between the interaction between the Philippines and America, the work of Carnegie Woodson really was the byproduct of that. We really start to see this emergence of similarities in other forms of colonization, similarities in other forms of conquering, similarities in other forms of educational, slavery, if you think about it. You know what I mean? Because the best way to enslave someone is to enslave their mind. I mean, really, their body is a byproduct of their mind. The brain controls the body's movement. So if your brain is conditioned to move when someone says move, you'll move when they say move, as opposed to moving on your own. So I definitely, as he was speaking, like I definitely, all that was really coming into complexity and into clear, in the sense that made sense. Like, that makes sense. Like, why all of a sudden, like and even in Carter's biography, like it briefly mentions that he went to the Philippines, but it doesn't give you any context of, like, why he was there, what he was doing. You kind of got to dig for that, and that's what I had to do as well. And I was like, I wonder, like, what was he doing in the Philippines? And it wasn't until the beginnings of this project, like I was like, okay, maybe there's a connection there between him going to the Philippines and then like the beginnings of the Miseducation of the Negro, which really didn't come out until a few years later. But still, I do believe the genesis of what he was trying to tackle was definitely found in his time spent in the Philippines, and that's what definitely spawned the thesis of the Miseducation of the Negro. And I think moving forward, I agree with Red that we really need to be very deliberate on making sure that we emphasize that part of his story, but also the part of history, in a sense that it just didn't come from like this random thin air place. It came from seeing similar tactics being done, in the world, and how really, and I think that's what we're getting at too, to this day. Like, we're sort of in the same boat in different ways.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, I'm looking at my Zoom information right now, and it's saying I've got 2 minutes and 50 seconds before this quits on us, and I am not willing to upgrade right now. So, just to bring this back full circle, next practical steps. Justin Mendoza, even though he's not able to join us this morning, he is 100% on board with using the University of Texas San Antonio Filipino Student Association's resources to help the cause of creating sustainable cities in the Philippines, and bettering the school facilities and educational facilities for students there in his homeland. He said there are connections across the state of Texas with the Filipino Student Association. It's not just going to be UTSA that he's pulling from in terms of resources. Also, Tita Yoli Moy with the Philippine American Chamber of Commerce expressed great concern through text, through phone conversations. We joined their Zoom meeting, and she said that they are on board, with bringing in leadership like Justin. She said they actually need young leaders to join the Philippine American Chamber of Commerce. So she says that they want to. Also, Dr. Kerry Lattimore, we've had communication with him. We've spoke with FaceTime conversation and various emails, who says he 100% supports the endeavor on behalf of the Philippine American Chamber of Commerce. And I think anytime there's an organization or institution that bears the name of an entire culture in their labeling, I think it is very important that they are involved with things, especially when it comes in terms of the youth wanting to step up to the plate. I think that those institutions and organizations, we all have an obligation to do everything that we can to support young people when they're trying to undo the miseducation. So with that being said, I appreciate both of you gentlemen. We've got a lot of work. This is just the beginning, got a lot of work ahead. Long partnership and collaboration. So, all right. Well, does anyone have anything to say before we
I,
Mhm.
Fernando, let's find a way to write together. I think our reflections on our brief conversation here, that's, I think we are almost obliged to put a couple of things together, and maybe in a year's time or two, we have a book on,
I agree.
on
Yes, absolutely.
I'd be
Awesome.
so excited
That
to
would
do
be
it.
very much so.